Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted that you're joining our webinar today to talk about electronic disclosure, the SEC regulations, and the Form Crs business case. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement throughout today's session. Please send a message to the panelists with your questions, and we will address them at the end of today's session. We specifically allotted 10 to 15 minutes to engage with you and your questions. And as with many of you, we are all working from home today. You may hear some background noise from time to time. We sincerely appreciate your understanding. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out a short survey to hear your feedback and continually improve. In the spirit of doing our part, we will be donating $25 for every survey response to the Direct Relief charity that is providing COVID-19 support for medical facilities and public health authorities in the US. Let me introduce today's panelists and let me start with asking Craig for an introduction.
Sure, thanks, Par. My name is Craig Foster. I am an attorney with Thompson Hine's Investment Management Group. I started my career as a general corporate lawyer back in 2008 in a full-service law firm in Portland, Oregon. After a couple years, I got more interested in working on investment management work and wanted to really make that a big part of my practice. And I found an opportunity to do that at Thompson Hine. Thompson Hine's group provides the full range of compliance and regulatory services to investment advisors, investment companies, brokers, and private funds. Me personally, I focus quite a bit on working with investment advisors of all types, robo-advisors, advisors to registered investment companies, advisors to retail clients, private fund advisors, and plan advisors. And on the side, I'm also a bit of a privacy lawyer. This year especially, a large part of my practice has been helping clients respond to data breaches. But I also help clients on the front end, helping with things like international and national compliance, working on terms of use and customer and internal privacy policies. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Craig. Let me pass the mic to Josh.
Thank you so much, Parm. And let me say thank you very much again for all of our guests today for joining us this afternoon. My name is Josh Hinderleiter. I am an associate with Thompson Hine. I've been with the firm since 2016 in our investment management practice group that Craig just outlined and detailed. My particular practice focuses on advising registered investment companies and their boards of trustees, including mutual funds and ETFs. I also work with registered investment advisors and broker-dealers on registration and ongoing legal and compliance matters. And along with Craig, and recently another one of our colleagues, we maintain and write a blog that focuses on legal and compliance needs for robo-advisors. You can find our blog at roboadvisor.com, and that's advisor with an ER. And while a lot of our content there may be focused on robo-advisors, for any traditional advisory firms attending today, a lot of the content would be very applicable for you as well. So please feel free to check it out if you get a chance. Thank you, Parm.
Thanks, Josh. Let me pass it over to David.
Well, thanks, Parm. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon, and thank you to all of our guests for dialing in for this conversation, which I think will be really interesting. My name is David Reeve. I'm the founder and CEO of InvestorCOM, and this topic is particularly interesting to me, and not only from a Reg BI perspective. Here we are in 2020, and we still have a substantial percentage of documents delivered physically, which is high cost, extremely slow, and typically not in our clients' best interest. So I'm super keen to join Craig and Josh to discuss how we can help change this and help the industry streamline document disclosure.
Thank you, David. And it's a pleasure to be your host today. My name is Paramount, and I'm the VP of Regulatory Strategy at InvestorCOM. Prior to joining InvestorCOM, I spent over a decade in the wealth management and regulatory field with some management consultancy experience. Okay, let's just jump into the agenda. If you've been, most of our webinars have focused around sort of the topic of Reg BI, but this recent sort of onslaught of regulatory pressure around Form CRS and disclosure obligations has brought today's panel together. Today, we will focus on we'll begin with background on the SEC's regulatory requirements around disclosure obligations, and we'll talk about the principles behind those requirements, and specifically document delivery. And finally, we'll highlight the benefits of adopting a digital delivery mechanism, focusing on the Form CRS case study, as we've talked about already. Finally, we'll have time allotted for a Q&A session where, as I said off the top, please engage with us using the chat box and submit your questions to our panelists. Okay, let's get started with a poll. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the effectiveness of new communication technology. Has COVID-19 changed the way you deliver documents to your clients? So we'll give you half of a minute and then we'll take up the answer. Okay, I'm curious to see what the responses are. So 54% of folks have answered yes and 46 said no. Interesting. I believe this is the backdrop to sort of the pressures of the COVID-19 pandemic and the growing investor demand for digital communication. And these two sort of factors have placed increasing pressure on the SEC to shift its physical delivery framework for investor communications. More recently, industry giants such as Fidelity, BlackRock, Schwab, and industry association groups like SIFMA, FSI, and IAA have publicly petitioned the SEC to shift their default delivery method from postal to e-delivery. While there's great momentum behind the e-delivery movement, there's little indication about when and if the regulators will change their policy position. So before your firm decides to shift to a paper-based delivery method, it's important to understand the SEC's delivery requirements. In today's webinar, we plan to distill the SEC's requirements to help firms comply with the regulations. We'll then apply the requirements using the Form CRS, as I explained earlier. So with that background, Craig, let me ask you our first question. Maybe we can start there. Can you give us a little bit of a history lesson or a contextual background on the regulations and why they're in place?
Yeah, sure can. So the principal laws governing brokers and advisors were adopted a long time ago. The Advisors Act was adopted in 1940. The Securities and Exchange Act was adopted in 1934. And even though, since then it's been amended and a lot of rules have been passed, the main disclosure and delivery method for communications was on paper for decades. And it wasn't really until the 1990s that widespread consumer use of computers and the internet really came into focus. And even in the 90s, what did digital even look like? The principal SEC guidance that we use today, and that Josh will talk a little bit more about, it highlights what people were doing in the 90s. Financial industry participants were delivering documents on CD-ROM. They were delivering things by fax. They were delivering things by even diskettes. I mean, I'm not even sure most of us have technology that could handle a computer diskette at this point. It always reminds me when I look at those releases of this time when I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. There was this exhibit that showed the history of our personal music devices. So it starts with a dusty old Victrola, it moves on to an 8-track, and then you get to an audio cassette, and it ends with this first generation iPod. And the idea behind the exhibit is to sort of leave the viewer wondering, how did we ever survive with such primitive tools? I mean, that's sort of what I always think about when I look at this guidance. The funny thing really is, though, while the examples in the guidance are completely outdated, the principles behind them are not. And Josh is going to go into that in more detail. And finally, this year especially, and as our poll just showed, even if you really prefer to meet with clients in person and have a cup of coffee over a nice shiny prospectus or a firm brochure, COVID might have just forced the issue for you and made you, like for many of us, figure out new ways of communicating with people.
Thanks, Greg. That's a really good backgrounder for us. David, let me turn it over to you. As I mentioned at the start of the conversation, in the past 2 months, there has been immense pressure on the regulators to review its rules and its policy position on the delivery of investor communications and foster an e-delivery framework suitable for the 21st century. In your respective view, what's the underpinning thesis behind the industry pressure?
Well, Parm, I think, when you say the last 2 months, pretty hard to ignore COVID, and, the acute impact of COVID is definitely accelerating digital transformation everywhere, including document delivery. But even if you ignore that, which is, obviously a huge factor, I think the most obvious reality is most investors have access to the internet in the US. US is ranking 3rd in the globe with most internet users. I think there's about 320 million. And we also know that most of these users prefer to receive documents such as compliance documents digitally. So, I think that's really important consideration. I think the other, thought that Craig just highlighted is the current regulations on the subject are actually pretty dated, and refreshing the SEC's delivery framework for investor communications is considered overdue by, I think, most stakeholders in the industry. The delivery of Form CRS is actually a point of sale obligation as well. So, when you think of a new client relationship, you're expected to deliver this disclosure in advance of a trade, certainly for a new client. And we all know the only practical point of sale delivery channel is digital. It takes days and weeks to deliver stuff via print and paper. And, I guess the last factor is cost is a massive factor. We would estimate the industry would save 75 to 90% compared to print and mail by digitizing this process. And, not everyone's mailing these, but we have a very large broker dealer who mailed almost 2 million of these documents. So, those savings, that particular case would represent several millions of dollars annually.
That's very insightful, David. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a quick poll. We'd like to know, what is the single biggest challenge of delivering documents digitally for you? Is it obtaining client email addresses? You're confused about the regulatory requirements? Is it integrating a technology solution? We'll give you half a minute again before taking up the answer. I'm really curious about this response here. So let's want to be a little patient, but give people time to respond. If you don't mind, Karen, let's see the answers. Ooh, I'm surprised about this. So it looks like it's a tie. Obtaining client email addresses and integrating technology solutions appears to be the biggest challenge. The regulatory requirements are less of a challenge for our audience today. Fantastic, very insightful, thank you. Okay, let's move on, and let me ask you a question, Josh. Can you walk us through the principles behind the SEC's regulatory requirements around document delivery?
Yeah, definitely, Parman. Thank you. And maybe for the few of our guests today who are a little confused, hopefully this will be a little bit enlightening. So I think Craig did a fantastic job of giving us kind of the holistic background of where the traditional regulations for electronic delivery come from, that being very old regulations that focused on paper delivery. And even the SEC's guidance on electronic delivery, as Craig rightfully noted, are pretty dated. And David touched on this as well. And it's not surprising then that you see the guidance comes from a series of releases from the SEC from 1995, 96, and 2000. So right around the advent of of mass use of the internet. And the focus for the SEC's guidance is electronic delivery has to have the same type of feel for your clients as a traditional paper delivery. So all of these that I'm going to go over, I'll keep tying it back to that paper delivery requirement, because that's really the context in which the SEC frames this. So how do you give clients the same experience electronically that you would through paper? Well, the SEC outlines a number of factors or prongs to consider. So the first one of those is notice. So in the SEC guidance, they highlight that an electronic client communication needs to be timely and proper in terms of the notice given. Unfortunately, the SEC doesn't go into great detail about defining exactly what those mean. But again, from taking the context of what does that mean in comparison to paper delivery, I think it gives a lot more context. So as an example, if you were to send a client statement out through traditional paper and it gets into the client's mailbox, they can open it, that's proper. So if you are sending an email, for example, to a client, that would have the same proper pronged, same effect for a client electronically that it would through traditional paper means. And it also has to be timely in the sense that, and I know this is maybe part of the antiquated nature of the guidance that we continue to talk about here. It can't be less timely than it would be to send it to them in mail. And I know that may sound counterintuitive to all of us now to say, well, it would probably be much faster to send it to them through an email than it would to put a letter in the mail. But that's how the guidance structures the notice prong. So once you have notice, the next thing to consider is client access. So again, in keeping with our theme, the clients have to have the same access to information that's being disseminated to them electronically that they would through traditional paper means. And there's two things to think about with this access prong. The first one is you can't impede access to clients when you're disseminating information electronically. And again, maybe using our example of sending out a client statement in the mail, the SEC would say, well, the client can open the envelope and take it out. So if your system is set up to send out the client statement via email, great. You're not impeding access in any more of a way than you are if you would send it through traditional mail. If perhaps you have a static client portal where all of their information, they get a new statement, you post it on the portal, and you send them an email notification letting them know that it's posted there. Well, if that link that you send them in the notification takes them to, say, your homepage, and they still have to click through to try to find where the portal is, now you're impeding their access. They're not opening that envelope and just taking the statement directly out. And the second prong to that is you can't impede the client's ability to retain the information either. So same thing as they're going to be able to take it out of the envelope and put it in their file cabinet. They have to either, if you're sending an email, be able to just click on the attachment, download it, store it electronically, print it, put it in their file cabinet, whatever. If you're in that instance of maybe the dedicated hosting site, they have to have the ability to download that. It can't just be stuck there on the site without their ability to retain it independently of the site. And then the third prong to consider is you've gone through all of this, you need to make sure that you have the client's consent to disseminate information electronically. There are two ways to obtain consent. One is a proof of access. So this means that if your system is set up to, if you're sending out the emails to clients with the attachment of the client statement, for example, if your system is set up to have a read receipt of that email, and you have the ability to store it and keep an accurate record of that, then that's proof of access. It's accepting client consent through behavior. Same thing if they're accessing the portal. If your system is logging the client's accesses to the portal, again, that's enough to have proof of access for the consent. The other way is obtaining the client's prior informed consent through a document that the client can turn back to. And the key there is it has to be informed consent. It can't be buried on page 17 and clause 5 of a client agreement that they're looking at. It should be a standalone document, and the document has to contain certain pieces of information, like specifically what medium are you going to disseminate the electronic communication to your clients through? Is it going to be email? And to David's point on cost, you have to disclose to them that there may be costs involved with electronic delivery. Again, this may seem counterintuitive to a lot of us to say, well, it may actually be more costly, and in most cases probably is more costly to send it through traditional mail, but again, maybe that speaks to the antiquated nature of the guidance. The informed consent also has to cover the duration and scope of the engagement, of how long or is the client consenting to the electronic delivery. And of course, the client always has to have the right to revoke its consent. So as long as you have all of that in there. And the last thing to touch on is really the record keeping requirements. And this is really an entity-facing issue. So for both registered investment advisors, broker-dealers, the Investment Advisors Act, the Exchange Act, they have pretty robust and extensive record-keeping requirements for you. And I'm sure many of our guests today are very well aware of them. And so when you're setting all of this up, it also is very important that you make sure that you have your system in place to retain your client communications pursuant to whatever regulation is applicable to you. So I think Param, in a whole, that kind of provides a holistic look at the guidance here.
Thanks, Josh. I think we've all become regulatory experts on this subject matter, given your fantastic background here. Let me sort of switch gears a little bit, given sort of the background and regulatory requirements you've outlined around e-disclosure. I think what's another piece of regulatory requirement that's floating around that's sort of had the June 30th deadline was regulation best interest and this obligation of delivering a Form CRS. David, can I turn it over to you and ask you to talk a little bit about the significance of the Form CRS and why is digital delivery so paramount now?
Absolutely. You know, I think we all know that Form CRS is a dynamic, not a static document, and that's you know, I think a super important consideration. The reason it's dynamic and living and breathing document is that it must be updated for any material changes in the advisor, broker, dealer, and client relationship. And because of this notion that it's a living and breathing document, that by the way, may need to be delivered multiple times annually. I don't think there's, you know, any particular known schedule in that regard. Again, it goes back to the number of, you know, instances of material changes. Then digital delivery is far more practical. You know, if you're doing an annual statement mailing or an annual, you know, event of static documents, you know, those, while, you know, it's still a very costly channel, those lend themselves more to a print mail channel, whereas something that has some notion of dynamism, practical to be delivered digitally. I think the other point that Joe just touched on extremely importantly, and Reg BI has some pretty strict direction around this, is record keeping.
Mhm.
The broker dealer is expected to record and track every Form CRS delivery. So again, imagine multiple deliveries in a distributed operation where you might have 1,000 advisors and tens or hundreds of thousands of clients. We all know digital delivery lends itself very well to record keeping. I mean, we all know if you're searching for an email that you sent out last week, last month, last year, ultimately, if it's digital, it's pretty easy to track that down. And, I think there's a lot of advanced record keeping platforms that make it even much easier than that. While ultimately print mail from a record keeping standpoint becomes a bit of a nightmare. So I think, when you consider this sort of dynamic element to the Form CRS and I would say the kind of naturally oriented features of digital delivery supporting both this notion of dynamic documents and record keeping, it's just a far, far more sensible channel for that particular document.
Thanks, David. I think this is sort of bringing to light the importance of embracing this digital delivery future of compliance documents for firms. Craig or Josh, let me ask you this question. I imagine you've had some firms who've decided that they want to make the leap forward and to embrace electronic delivery. What practical advice would you give such clients?
Yeah, I'll take that. So, I think the biggest issue is really going to be consent, and it's going to be a business decision. Whether you get the prior informed consent or whether you rely on proof of access, as Josh talked about, is going to depend on a few things. One is, what's the method of communication of e-delivery you're going to use? Are you going to use email? Are you going to use an app? Are you going to have a website portal? Does your method of communication make it easy to get proof of access or not? Another thing to think about is your population size. How many clients do you have? Do you have tens? Do you have hundreds? Do you have thousands?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, whether you have close relationships with clients that make it easy to get informed consent. I mean, you may know all your clients personally. It may be not a big deal at all to get prior informed consent, but maybe not. So that's definitely going to affect what decision you decide to make. Some other considerations, what technology solution are you going to use? Are you going to try to automate it? Will you require it contractually as a condition of your services? I mean, some robo-advisors who want to be completely digital, do not want to deal in paper, will actually say you have to go electronic or we can't really work with you. Josh talked about another issue about revoking consent. You got to think about the practicalities. Once you get that revoked consent, how fast can you act on it? David mentioned another big issue is just the practicalities of record keeping. You have all of these record keeping requirements about communications, especially important disclosure documents required by law like Form CRS. And finally, you're going to be sending out sensitive information. So you need to think about cybersecurity. How tightly is the information that you're going to send? Is it locked down?
All right, I was having a little bit of trouble finding the mute button. So let's skip forward a little bit. Let's ask, we've been doing a lot of talking. Let's engage our audience and do a poll. We want to know, once that poll pops up, how are you meeting your Form CRS or ADV2B delivery obligations today? Could be printing them and mailing it to your clients. According to David, there's been some instances of folks doing that across their entire client base. Could be using a technology solution that enables the delivery, or you could just not be sure. Give it. Thank you. Excellent. It sounds like folks are embracing a technology solution. Some are actually still doing a physical delivery and some who are not sure. Thank you. That's very interesting. Okay. So in our white paper that we're going to be sharing with folks following today's session, we've outlined a few key arguments for why firms would want to embrace digital delivery of the Form CRS. David, would you mind summarizing some of the key reasons that we've outlined in this paper?
Sure. You know, I think if you look at the overall subject of digital delivery, I would say of any compliance document, certainly Form CRS ADV falls into this. There's a pretty big disconnect between investor choice and the digital delivery rates in the industry. I mean, you know, again, you'd think in 2020, virtually everything would be digitally delivered, but that's not the case. Most investors prefer to receive documents digitally. A number of surveys have borne that out. And, you know, the relationships we have with our clients, that, you know, there's a strong desire when you make the sort of process that has been described earlier frictionless. Most people opt for that. And, you know, there's all kinds of reasons for that. There's heightened sensitivity to the environment. There's a view that digital delivery, you know, the security around digital delivery, I think the perception is that that's, you know, that's increased substantially. And you know, the other reality is there's changing demographics. You know, most firms are looking at their demographics changing. There's a huge wealth transfer going to the younger generations who not only prefer digital relationships, they expect digital relationships. And by the way, this goes far beyond document delivery into onboarding and really servicing clients digitally. The other reality, we talked about that earlier, is you know, this notion of a little bit of a chronic requirement for digitization has become pretty acute in the last 6 months. And so, you know, firms and you know, people can kind of ignore the inevitable, I think, but, you know, when they're hit with a huge shock like we just have, but it's very difficult to actually leverage some of the traditional channels. So I think that's a really, really important note. You know, ultimately, despite all these arguments, and I'd say owing to some regulatory challenges and friction associated with gaining consent and frankly getting emails, digital delivery still significantly lags expectations. And, you know, in my, I always whisper 30-year career, I've never seen a more compelling business case. It's a win-win. It's better for the clients, better for the, better ultimately for the broker dealers, better for the environment. I suppose, you know, the U.S. Postal Service and some printers may not feel that way, but, you know, largely key stakeholders would say this is a massive win-win-win.
Thank you, David. Okay, for folks who have who enjoyed today's conversation, please let us know if you have any questions. You can send them directly to us through the chat application. Having said that, we appreciate your attendance today and your engagement. We have a white paper that captures today's insights. We will be sharing it with you following today's session. Okay, so now we're at the juncture where we're going to take up questions. Let me just flip it over, give folks a quick minute. Okay, so first question, it's not directed to anybody. If I need to update my Form CRS, how long do I have to deliver the updated Form CRS to my clients? Maybe I'll jump in because I know the answer off the top of my head. There is a requirement, if there's a material change to the Form CRS, for folks to make the change and file it with the regulators within 30 days. And after it's been filed with the regulators, firms have 60 days, an additional 60 days to deliver the updated Form CRS to their clients. This sort of tags along with the point David made in that the document's it's an evergreen document, it's a dynamic document, and it's going to require multiple deliveries throughout a given year. Okay, one more scan at the questions. I've got a question that says, Craig and Josh, in your view, why is it important to hash out the regulations now?
Craig, if maybe do you want to take that?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think it's for a lot of the reasons that that have been mentioned. It's right now we're just in a time period. If it wasn't important before, it's important now, where folks are just being forced to go digital, and to get a clearer picture of what the SEC expects beyond the guidance that we have from the mid-90s.
Thanks, Greg. This might be one more question for either you or Josh. Could you restate the consent for electronic delivery? Specifically, the statement made with regards to tracking customers' access to documents.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one, Parham. So I think if I understand the question, you're asking about the proof of access prong of the consent. So it essentially is, depending on how your system is set up, if you are disseminating information to clients, say via email, then your system has to be set up so that you're receiving, let's say, a read receipt back when the client actually opens and accesses the email. And you have to be able to maintain a record of that so that you can prove that there has been proof of access by the client. Similarly, if it was a client portal or some static access point where the client is going in to access those documents, then your system should have something set up where when the client logs in, there's a log that's keeping track of that. And again, it's something that you could keep on for your own records to show that the client is actually accessing the information electronically.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, we've got two more questions in the pipeline. I'll go to the shorter one first. For firms that elect to use electronic delivery, what guidance do you have where there is an email bounce back? I think the question is, what guidance do you have when in instances where there's an email bounce back?
Yeah, hey, Parham, I can take this on. I know we have clients that have this challenge and have a solution. So from a technology standpoint, one of our clients has a process whereby if there's an email bounce, then it automatically goes into the print channel. Typically, what clients would do is, when an email bounces, I think there's, the key reason it's bouncing is because of an inaccurate email address. So, one of the workflows is go back to the advisor, have them correct the email address, and then reinitiate that electronic delivery. But, it's always great, I think, to have, first of all, a line of sight on any bounce backs, and then having a traditional channel to deliver those Form Crs, which one of our major clients uses.
Thanks, David. Okay, I'm going to try to summarize this question. So I think the question's suggesting that there's a lot of documents that need to be delivered to clients. New clients may receive up to dozens of documents sent via email. What happens when a client states that he or she did not see the document because it was 50 plus pages? So I'm breaking it up into two parts. Anybody want to take a stab at the first question?
I can talk a little bit about that. So that's very common to have a lot of onboarding documents. One protection we often do is in your client agreement, which a client of any of the documents, hopefully they're reading everything they get, but it's one of the more likely documents that they'll get is that we have clients acknowledge their receipt in the agreement itself, that they received all of those documents. The other thing too is that if you have financial advisors that are working with a client, it's not a bad idea for those advisors who are talking to them to reference the Form CRS as well. So there's a few additional ways of making sure that clients are getting them. But ultimately, your obligation is that that it gets delivered, and not so much that the client reads it. So as long as you can kind of show that the client got it, you'll be all right, and hopefully, you can find ways of engaging the client with it.
And Parham, you're aware. I mean, I think technology platforms, certainly our technology platform, if you're delivering 12 documents, would provide very, very clear supervision around what documents were opened and what documents were read. So that's very, very clear. And if the broker dealer wants to follow up with the client, then they've got the information to do so.
So speaking of this read receipts, there is a really good question. I'm going to read it out, and then maybe we can just paraphrase exactly what's meant by this. So with read receipts, the recipient has to choose to send receipt, which is why I have not relied on that in the past. Thoughts? So let me paraphrase this a little bit. From what I understand, the question is asking, hey, if I'm relying on this read receipt, the recipient has to actually deliver that receipt. And I don't know if that's the case. I think with technology, you can actually track that automatically. Anybody want to take a stab at that question?
I mean,
my 2 cents on it, Param, just to follow up on yours. If the system is not set up in that way in which the client has to choose whether or not to send the read receipt back, then that's probably not sufficient. There's probably some extra step you should consider in taking to make sure that you feel comfortable you can meet consent through proof of access. And I don't know if David or Craig have additional thoughts on that.
well, I mean, my guess is Michelle's referring to Outlook, where we're all aware that if someone puts a read receipt on that, you can disable it. I think more advanced document disclosure platforms, which are typically delivering documents through hyperlinks. Certainly our platform does that. Then you have very, very clear, and the investor is not choosing whether read receipt occurs or not. When they click on the relevant document, the system automatically updates the read receipt on that. So it's transparent to the client.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for answering these questions. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the log here. I see that we're 2 minutes ahead of time, which is fantastic. We can all have an additional 2 minutes to our day. If there's no other questions, I'm going to thank everybody for attending today's session. Special thanks to Craig and Josh and David for being our wonderful panelists for today's session.
This was great. Thank you to all of our guests who took time out of their day to be with us.
Thanks, Josh. And we will have a survey sent out to you shortly to hear if you have any feedback for us. Thank you all for attending today's session. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Param.
Thank you.